Welcome to the third of my videos about Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution. Now in this video, I want to take one final bit of background knowledge, if you like, that's needed before you can really start on the history of the Russian Revolution. And that's to describe the character of the workers' parties, the Menshevik and Bolshevik wings of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the political differences that would particularly emerge during 1917 to show who was really on the side of the socialist revolution, and the theoretical differences between the various wings of the movement. But first of all, we need to start with the 1905 revolution, which Trotsky describes in his 1917 history as the prologue of the two revolutions of 1917 of February and October. And the background to 1905 was Russia's disastrous war with Japan, which had exposed the rottenness of the Tsarist autocracy and its military generals. And at the beginning of January, a citywide general strike gripped Petrograd, and it was called in response to the sacking of 4 trade unionists. And the well-known event of Bloody Sunday on January the 9th, an unarmed demonstration to the Tsar's Winter's Palace, was mowed down by his troops, leaving 1,000 dead. That, of course, only deepened the strike movement, which spread across the main cities, accompanied by peasant land seizures and mutinies in the Black Sea Fleet as well. All of this culminated in the uprising of December 1905, and although it was defeated, all of these events were an important dress rehearsal for the revolutions of 1917. And this new, unheard of level of workers' activity also created a new form of organisation, the Soviet. These workers' councils, comprising of elected deputies from each section of the workers in struggle, invented to organise the general strike and the struggle for power, were a really important step forward. Not only the workers, but also the peasants and the revolutionary parts of the army also looked to the Soviets for a lead. And of course, this idea of Soviets wasn't forgotten. The workers immediately returned to this form of organisation during the revolutionary events of 1917. And 1905 also confirmed the points that I'd raised in the previous video about the attitude of the so-called liberal bourgeoisie. They took one look over the precipice of revolution and then hurriedly backed away into the camp of reaction. This had left the way clear for the army to bloodily defeat the workers and peasants, but it absolutely showed in practice that they were not to be trusted. So the question I just raised first of all, though, why are Soviets such an important tool for revolutionaries? Well, the Soviet, or a workers' council, made up of different delegates subject to recall, is a very flexible way of judging the mood of the workers, of those changes of mass consciousness. They're able to respond rapidly to a new situation, to discuss new demands, democratically debate ideas, and of course, to provide class leadership at each stage of the movement, which is then taken back into the class, with the Soviet providing that leadership. And in a later book, The Transitional Program, from the late 1930s, Trotsky wrote about the Soviets. He said, "Ever new layers of the oppressed will raise their heads and come forward with their demands. Workers, unemployed workers, farmers, the oppressed of the cities, women workers, proletarianized layers of the intelligentsia, all of these will seek unity and leadership. How are the different demands and forms of struggle to be harmonized? History has already answered this question. Through Soviets, all political currents of the proletariat can struggle for leadership of the Soviets on the basis of the widest democracy. The slogan of Soviets, therefore, crowns the program of transitional demands." And as we will see later, the history of 1917 is very much tied up with the Bolsheviks gaining a majority in the Soviets over that period of time. But the other key thing about Soviets, which we really haven't got time to go into now, is that they became not just the organisers of the revolution, but they then became the embryo of a future workers' government to actually organising the workers' state. And that's something which Lenin particularly takes up in State and Revolution. There's another question perhaps we need to think about. Will the working class in Britain or other countries organise Soviets as well? Well, history shows that the working class always creates collective bodies of some kind to organise the struggle, whether it's strike committees and support groups or broader workers' councils, particularly in revolutionary events, whether it's the Paris Commune, whether it was the industrial belts, the Cordones in Chile, the neighbourhood resistance committees recently in Sudan. Exactly what form of organisation will arise, you can't say precisely. It will depend on the traditions and the character of the masses in struggle. But what we can say is they will arise, but as Trotsky points out in the transitional programme, only when the mass movement enters into openly revolutionary struggle. From the first moment of their appearance, the Soviets, acting as a pivot around which millions of toilers are united in their struggle, they become competitors and opponents of local authorities and then of the central government. The Soviets initiate a period of dual power. And that's a phrase, an idea that we'll return to in later videos. Now, in discussing the role that the workers' movement could have in Russia, it's impossible not to also discuss the issue of their relationship with the peasantry. Because the Russian working class was such a small minority of the nation that if it was going to lead a struggle against the Tsarist state, it had to have the support of the poor peasantry, which provided a vast potential ally. It was facing a desperate situation, thanks to the unequal land distribution and backwardness of agriculture, held back by inefficient methods of farming with small peasant plots using outdated technique. And Trotsky explains how in 1905, it was only about half of the privately owned land that belonged to just 30,000 great landowners, the equivalent area to what was owned by 10 million peasant families. And as Trotsky comments, these land statistics constitute the finished program of a peasant war. And the law of combined development had meant that the peasant had a desperate battle to try and match prices with those set by the productive farming methods of modern agriculture. However, before Russian history could pass on to more rational and intensive methods, the peasants saw one last avenue might be open to them, and when that was to forcibly seize land from the landlords directly. Scared by the struggles of 1905, the landlords made some concessions to the better off peasants through a large-scale selling off of land. And then in 1906, the government introduced a law giving the rich peasants, known as kulaks, meaning fist in Russia, giving them the right to buy off sections of land. Now, even if the majority of peasants were against it. Now, this was clearly an attempt to create a layer of wealthy capitalist kulak farmers to provide a much needed point of support for the Tsar's regime. One of their ministers describes it, according to Trotsky, as a policy of banking on the strong ones. Now, the method did create a certain boom in agriculture, but actually created far more opposition than it ever gained support for the Tsar and the counter-revolution. It only drove the mass of peasantry into further ruin, unable to compete with the cheap grain that the new farmers could produce. Many sold up their bits of land to become landless workers, adding further explosive material to the proletarian population. Now, some peasants sought to find refuge in cooperatives that were supported and idealised by the rich Narodnik intelligentsia, from Narod, meaning people. But of course these provided no real solution. Real power again belonged to the richest peasants in the commune. And these ideas of the Narodniks had arisen amongst the liberal Russian intellectuals in the mid-19th century. They looked to the peasantry as being the revolutionary section of Russian society, and they believed that Russia could advance to some form of socialism based on peasant collectives without undergoing a capitalist development. But these utopian ideas, of course, failed to succeed. And as a result, one section of the Narodniks turned to the idea of using individual terrorism in the hope of provoking a peasant uprising. And the hanging of Lenin's brother after an assassination attempt certainly influenced the young Lenin to reject the ideas of the Narodniks, but instead turn towards Marxism, turn towards the emancipation of labour group, which Plekhanov had set up as a break from Narodnik politics. Now, after 1900, several of the remaining Narodnik groups helped to form the Social Revolutionaries, the SRs, a left party based largely on the peasantry that was an important factor in the 1917 revolutions. But this is where it arose. But another question to ask is, why would Marxism say that a movement based on the hope of an independent peasant struggle was doomed largely to failure? Well, that's because Marxism would see the peasantry as part of the intermediate petty bourgeois layer, a layer acting between the two big classes of the bourgeois and the proletariat, always looking to one or the other for leadership. The peasantry was always going to be divided between rich and poor, with each peasant having primarily their own individual interests at heart. It could not act as an independent revolutionary force. But what was to be unique about the Russian Revolution was that for the first time in history, as Trotsky explains in chapter 3 of the Proletariat and the Peasantry chapter, that for the first time in world history, the peasant was destined to find a leader in the person of the worker. In that lies the fundamental, and you may say the whole, difference between the Russian Revolution and all those preceding it. In order to realise the Soviet state, there was a drawing together of two factors belonging to completely different historic species. A peasant war, a movement characteristic of the dawn of bourgeois development, and a proletarian insurrection, the movement signalising its decline. That is the essence of 1917. Now, from those foundations built by Plekhanov, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, was built and grew in the underground workers' movement. Now, we haven't got time for a really detailed history, but as is often raised by opponents of Trotsky, it's worth mentioning that it's true that in its early congress in 1903, it unexpectedly split into two factions over seemingly insignificant disagreements about party rules, and that Trotsky found himself at the very beginning agreeing with the Menshevik minority. Lenin, leader of the majority Bolshevik group, initially tried to bring about unity, but soon realised that the two tendencies represented clear differences within the party and formally set up his Bolshevik faction. Under the impact of events, not least the defeated revolution of 1905, those two tendencies gradually crystallised out into two distinct political parties, and Lenin's Bolsheviks finally made a formal split in 1912, once Lenin was sure that he had got the confident support of the large majority of the organised working class. Now, Trotsky had tried to build on the mood for unity created by 1905 and campaigned for the two factions to unite, while he personally took up a position independent of both factions outside both groups. But he was honest enough to admit in later life that he made the mistake. He made the mistake of overestimating the importance of trying to win the left wing of the Mensheviks back to Bolshevism, whereas Lenin had correctly recognised that the political differences had become insurmountable. But the real differences between Menshevism and Bolshevism weren't organisational, they were political. And Trotsky had quickly broken with the Mensheviks over the central political question that was the main difference between the two tendencies. And that was the attitude of the workers' movement to the supposedly progressive capitalist class. On that, Lenin and Trotsky were absolutely united. In fact, it was Trotsky who really provided the greatest political clarity on the issue. Now, Lenin, in direct opposition to the Mensheviks, explained that the workers should not ally themselves with the capitalist class, but rather with the poor peasant masses. And he put forward the slogan of fighting for the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Now, what does that mean exactly? By dictatorship, Lenin meant not a lack of democracy, but that a workers' and peasants' government would have to fight against the desperate resistance of Tsarism, the landlords, and indeed the bourgeoisie as well. And the democratic part of the formula expressed recognition of the bourgeois rather than socialist character of the task to be carried out by the revolution, abolition of the monarchy, land to the peasants, and so on. However, Lenin warned that the peasantry could not be a socialist ally of the workers, for it had its own petty bourgeois interests at heart and would be satisfied with the limited gains of the bourgeois revolution. But he believed that once that democratic dictatorship had been victorious, the workers wouldn't simply have to submit to a peasant counter-revolution. No, for Lenin, though, the fate of the revolution was inextricably linked with the world revolution. He believed a bourgeois revolution in Russia would then spur on the proletariat of the advanced countries that were ripe for socialist revolution and in turn come to the support of the workers in Russia. Now, Trotsky's main difference with Lenin was that he had drawn the conclusion that the peasantry could definitely not play an independent role as a class. And therefore he felt it was incorrect to talk of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, as this suggested that the peasantry could play equally as important role as the working class. For Trotsky, only two perspectives were possible. Either the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, with the peasants becoming an instrument of reaction, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, leaning on the peasantry as an instrument of revolution. And he drew on his analysis of the law of combined development, putting forward his famous theory of permanent revolution. And that was the theory that really provided the clearest perspective for how events developed in 1917. Trotsky said that just as Russia combined backward feudalism with the latest advances of international capitalism, so the Russian Revolution could combine the overthrow of feudalism with a permanent, or perhaps to be more accurate, uninterrupted move to socialist tasks, ending in international revolution. Trotsky felt that Lenin's formula left it unclear as to how far the revolutionary working class in Russia could go beyond just those bourgeois tasks. But Trotsky proposed that if the Russian proletariat came to power, rather than being simply limited by simply bourgeois demands, they could begin the international socialist revolution in Russia itself. He drew the conclusion from 1905 that in the given conditions in Russia, it would be possible for the working class to take power in its own dictatorship of the proletariat. Writing back in 1906, Trotsky explained that in an economically more backward country, the proletariat may come to power sooner than a country more advanced capitalistically. It seems to me that the Russian Revolution will create such conditions that the power may, in the event of a victory, must pass into the hands of the proletariat. Trotsky agreed that the revolution had to be bourgeois, but that it would be a mistake to overlook the perspective that upon coming to power, as Trotsky put it, the logic of the situation would push the proletariat itself towards the management of the economy at the expense of the state, coming into the government not as helpless hostages, but as the leading force. The representatives of the proletariat would, by virtue of that alone, place collectivism on the order of the day. And he adds, at what point in that tendency the proletariat will be stopped will depend on the interrelation of forces, certainly not on the initial intentions of the proletariat's party. So in short, Trotsky was arguing, as indeed happened in 1917, that the working class could begin the socialist tasks of building a workers' state and taking the means of production from the capitalists without artificially having to hold back its demands, as perhaps the Mensheviks would suggest. Trotsky, like Lenin, had the same internationalist perspective though. He agreed that the fate of the Russian Revolution would rest with the European working class. Spurred on by the Russian proletariat, they could link revolutions and come together to build a socialist federation to protect backward Russia from bourgeois restoration. But Trotsky feared that Lenin's imprecise formula could, at the critical moment, effectively open the door to Menshevism and suggest to the workers that they had to hold back. And in Appendix 2 of his History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, he writes what he wrote, in fact, in 1909. If the Mensheviks, starting from the abstraction, our revolution is a bourgeois revolution, arrive at the idea of adapting the whole tactic of the proletariat to the conduct of the liberal bourgeoisie, then the Bolsheviks, starting from an equally bare abstraction, a democratic and not a socialist dictatorship, will arrive at the idea of a bourgeois democratic self-limitation of the proletariat. Now, to be sure, the difference between them on this question is considerable. While the anti-revolutionary sides of Menshevism are expressed in their full strength even now, the anti-revolutionary side of Bolshevism threatens a great danger only in the case of a revolutionary victory. Now, actually, those warnings were to be precisely borne out in the struggles within the Bolshevik Party in 1917, as we'll look at later. Unfortunately, it was Lenin's own intervention that ensured that Bolshevism didn't retreat in the hour of revolution. And the key point is that in those key moments of 1917, Lenin and Trotsky were to find themselves united against the opposition, certainly of the Mensheviks, but even some of the Bolsheviks' own party leadership, in warning of the disastrous results of any alliance of the workers' movement with the so-called liberal Russian bourgeoisie. The reality is that Menshevism and Bolshevism were heading towards two completely different directions. One simply to reform at best, only the Bolsheviks to socialist revolution, because Bolshevism reflected the pressure of the revolutionary aspirations of both the workers and the poor peasants. But their small forces were left to fight alone alongside the workers during those difficult years of reaction after the defeat of 1905. Menshevism reflected that thin upper layer of workers and petty officials who in reality had no stomach for the socialist fight, and so preached collaboration with the liberal bourgeoisie. According to the Mensheviks, feudalism, capitalism, then socialism must follow each other in a clearly defined and well-separated succession, and therefore any talk of socialism in Russia was dangerous adventurism. And for a layer of middle-class intellectuals, that simplified view of Marxism seemed to reassuringly justify their own cowardice when it came to revolutionary struggle. And it has to be noted, especially given that the Stalinists were those that threw a lot of mud at Trotsky about his supposed Menshevism, that it certainly wasn't Trotsky, but it was the Stalinists who effectively resurrected Menshevik ideas, when they later betrayed the revolution, replacing the banner of international revolution with the slogan of socialism in one country, and adopting the two-stage theory of colonial revolution, where the socialist revolution was relegated to a distant future goal, while workers in the meantime were urged to precisely build alliances with the liberal bourgeoisie. That abandonment of genuine Marxism, of Bolshevism, led to countless tragedies, such as the bloody defeat of the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 27, not to mention other defeats such as in Spain and Chile and many others. And of course, even where capitalism was defeated, the colonial revolution became derailed along the distorted lines of proletarian Bonapartism, where petty bourgeois leaders set up totalitarian regimes in the image of Stalinist Russia, instead of the proletariat playing a leading role in fighting for healthy socialist workers' states. That concludes these first three videos with their introduction to the main theoretical ideas. The next video will start to move on to the actual revolutionary events themselves, but first looking at the effects of the First World War on the movement and how it later led to the revolutionary situation in 1917.